Are you ready to play trivia? There's 50 questions, and you must guess the country where the monuments are. Quiz choose. 1. In what country do we find the Eiffel Tower?
Deposit photos music.
France. 2. In what country do we find the Great Wall of China? China. 3. In what country do we find the Taj Mahal?
Deposit photos music.
India. 4. In what country do we find the Statue of Liberty? USA. In what country do we find the Colosseum? Italy. 6. In what country do we find Machu Picchu? Peru. 7. In what country do we find the Sydney Opera House? Australia. 8. In what country do we find Christ the Redeemer? Brazil.
Deposit photos.
9. In what country do we find Big Ben? United Kingdom. 10. In what country do we find Mount Fuji? Japan.
Deposit photos.
11. In what country do we find the Pyramids of Giza? Egypt. 12. In what country do we find the Leaning Tower of Pisa? Italy.
Deposit photos music.
13. In what country do we find the Burj Khalifa? UAE. 14. In what country do we find Angkor Wat? Cambodia.
Deposit photos music.
15. In what country do we find Neuschwanstein Castle? Germany. 16. In what country do we find Petra?
Deposit photos music.
Jordan. 17. In what country do we find Table Mountain? South Africa. 18. In what country do we find the Louvre?
Deposit photos music.
France. 19. In what country do we find the Kremlin? Russia. 20. In what country do we find Chichen Itza?
Deposit photos music.
Mexico. 21. In what country do we find the Golden Gate Bridge? USA. 22. In what country do we find the Forbidden City?
Deposit photos music.
China. 23. In what country do we find the Moai statues? Easter Island. 24. In what country do we find the Acropolis?
Deposit photos music.
Greece. 25. In what country do we find Mount Kilimanjaro? Tanzania. 26. In what country do we find the Brandenburg Gate?
Photos music.
Germany. 27. In what country do we find Buckingham Palace? United Kingdom. 28. In what country do we find Iguazu Falls? Argentina. 29. In what country do we find the Sagrada Familia? Spain. 30. In what country do we find the Alhambra? Spain. 31. In what country do we find Stonehenge? United Kingdom. 32. In what country do we find St. Basil's Cathedral? Russia. 33. In what country do we find Serengeti National Park? Tanzania.
Deposit photos.
34. In what country do we find Notre Dame Cathedral? France. 35. In what country do we find Banff National Park? Canada.
Deposit photos music.
36. In what country do we find the Opera House in Oslo? Norway. 37. In what country do we find the Tajik National Library? Tajikistan.
Deposit photos music.
38. In what country do we find Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque? UAE. 39. In what country do we find the Shard?
Deposit photos.
United Kingdom. 40. In what country do we find Uluru Ayers Rock? Australia. 41. In what country do we find Jain Bakgung Palace?
Deposit photos music.
South Korea. 42. In what country do we find Himeji Castle? Japan. 43. In what country do we find Mont Saint-Michel?
Deposit photos music.
France. 44. In what country do we find the Parthenon? Greece. 45. In what country do we find Niagara Falls?
Deposit photos music.
Canada and USA. 46. In what country do we find Edinburgh Castle? Scotland. 47. In what country do we find the Blue Mosque?
Deposit photos music.
Turkey. 48. In what country do we find the Terracotta Army? China. 49. In what country do we find Vatican City?
Deposit photos music.
Vatican City. 50. In what country do we find the Alamo? USA. Thanks for watching Quiz Choose.